Tunisia has a reputation internationally of being a kind of liberal society.
Testing. was involved in this from the very beginning, and just say that I hope you'll all stay with the conference and that we'll have a very interesting time. We're also, of course, here partly to acknowledge the contributions of Cedric here, and I think that is in fact a wonderful opportunity for us to do that. I think your contributions have been really, really significant. So with that, I'll turn it back to Ruthie and we can get the regular proceedings going. But thank you very much.
Thank you, David. So without further ado, I will turn the program over to Jordan, and maybe all of my misspeaking didn't make it into live stream because I didn't use the microphone. But from here on out, everyone use the microphone, please. All right, thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Jordan Camp. I'm a postdoctoral research associate in the Center for African American Studies at Princeton University. And I'm honored and delighted to be the moderator on this panel on ideological struggle and the radical political imagination. Let me begin briefly by situating our session within the context of the conversations we'll be having over the next 2 days. From Black Marxism to his most recent study, Forgeries of Memory and Meaning, Cedric Robinson has examined how Black radical intellectuals, artists, and activists have offered bold counters to the common sense about the history of racial capitalism and of US imperialism. As a culture of liberation, Robinson argues, the tradition has been able to overcome geographical barriers and link with anti-imperialist and liberationist projects in Africa, Asia, the Americas, and Europe. Writers, artists, journalists, and activists have used poetry, literature, radio, newspaper, magazines, oral history, photography to tap the collective memory of freedom struggles in the past and to inspire and legitimate new visions of solidarity among oppressed people beyond borders. In doing so, they have done more than simply protest unjust material conditions brought about by the advances of capital. They have created counter-archives of the freedom dreams of aggrieved and insurgent peoples that go well beyond the territorial boundaries of US empire. While the radical political and economic demands of the long Black freedom struggle are rarely taken seriously in contemporary debates about alternatives to neoliberalism, their visions of freedom could have served as a viable alternative to the grim neoliberalism in which we live. They show how racism has come to be taken for granted as a justification for the relations of class power on one hand, and that hegemony is always subject to contestation on the other, provoking resistance and criticism that offers alternative definitions of reality. From the global movements to confront austerity and war, to mass struggles against water shutoffs in Detroit, to protest against racism and state violence in Ferguson, to the battles against broken windows and community policing in Los Angeles, to New York, London, and beyond, we have been witness to political and ideological struggles over the meaning of the material conditions that could have had alternative outcomes. The roots, I would argue, of a new society are located within the contradictions of the political economy of policing, prisons, and permanent war. This struggle requires political organization to fire the radical political imagination of the possibility of alternatives. This panel features journalists, historians, artists, and scholar activists whose work has illuminated radical histories and cultures of liberations that have sought to confront the conceits of a perverse racialism that is masqueraded as memory and meaning. In doing so, they show that alternative futures have been and continue to be possible. Let me briefly introduce our speakers. They will go in the order they're sitting here today. but I won't introduce them in that order. Tulani Davis is an assistant professor in the Afro-American Studies Department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She recently completed her PhD in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis at NYU. She is currently at work on a book entitled Fugitive Freedoms, A Race, Politics and Black Culture Circuit Before Civil Rights. She is a longtime journalist, playwright, and author of 6 books, including the nonfiction work, My Confederate Kinfolk, and the novels 1959 and Maker of Saints. She wrote the scripts for films including Paid in Full, as well as several award-winning PBS documentaries, including one I'm very fond of entitled W.B. Du Bois, A Biography in 4 Voices. Davis wrote the libretti for Anthony Davis's Amistad and X, The Life and Times of Malcolm X, and recently completed a musical on an 1881 strike of laundry workers in the South. Davis is also a past Grammy winner and Grammy nominee, and has been the recipient of many awards for his writing, scholarship, and advocacy. Tulani's presentation today is titled The Building of Political Structures on Networks After the Civil War. Elizabeth Robinson, to my left, has been a longtime community media activist, advocate, and producer for more than 30 years at the local, national, and international levels. She's the co-host and producer for 2 current radio and television programs, No Alibis on KCSB 91.9 FM, which she co-hosts with Avery Gordon, and Third World's News Review, which she co-hosts with Cedric Robinson, and she also works with AMARC, World Association of Community Radio Broadcasters. As a journalist and Arab American, she has particularly attempted to provide corrective information about the Middle East. This politically engaged journalism has developed in dialogue and in collaboration with her life partner, Cedric Robinson. She occasionally writes, frequently broadcasts, has mentored hundreds of broadcasters, including me, as I had the unique opportunity to work with she and Avery on No Alibis as a graduate student for several years, and can attest to the fact that she is convinced that every voice is a radio voice, particularly since she thought it was worthwhile to include my own, and with its Southern accent. While people have expressed a lot of excitement about this event, we're excited that the proceedings from the next 2 days will be available for purchase as part of the fund drive for Santa Barbara's community radio station that you directed for 30 years? 20-some. Okay. Elizabeth's presentation today is titled To Inform, Deceive, or Empower, the Realities and Possibilities of Media. Paul Ortiz, at the end of the table, is the director of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program and associate professor of history at the University of Florida. His publications include the book Emancipation Betrayed, which is a history of the Black freedom struggle in Florida, and the co-edited volume, Remembering Jim Crow, African Americans Tell About Life in the Jim Crow South, which I believe is in its 4th printing. His forthcoming monograph is titled Our Separate Struggles Are Really One, African American and Latino Histories, which will be published by Beacon Press. He's the recipient of numerous awards for his books, including the Lillian Smith Book Prize awarded by the Southern Regional Council. And I have to add, if there was a CLR James Award for commitment to documenting the self-activity of working people and advancing the struggle for the new society, Paul would have certainly been bestowed this honor. This commitment in his writing and teaching are legendary and stem from his longtime dedication as an organizer, scholar, activist, and mentor to many, including, I'm honored to say, myself as a junior scholar. At an earlier point in his life, Paul worked as an organizer with the United Farm Workers. He has also worked with the Farm Labor Organizing Committee in North Carolina. He also started an oral history program at Duke University, which he didn't mention. Paul is currently president of the Oral History Association and membership chair for the University of Faculty of Florida's Union Chapter. The title of his presentation today is Anti-Imperialism, Slavery, and Jim Crow, Juan Crow, Recovering Traditions of Struggle. So join me in welcoming our first speaker, Elizabeth Robinson.
Hello, everyone. I want, of course, to thank the institutions, but the people more than the institutions. Of course, Jordan, who I knew would embarrass me with whatever it was he did as an introduction, and Christina and Ruthie. I also have to say, it's always good for me to see somebody who wasn't acknowledged, but should be always, and that's Craig Gilmore, because he is my partner at these things when we say, we're not academics, you know, we're just, we do stuff, but we're not academics. So that's my caveat, I suppose, to begin with. I also want to say you'll hear me end with something that just happened, which was sharing a microphone, which I think is critical. When Jordan first sent me a description of this panel, indicating that the organizers would like me to talk about how I would interpret my journalistic work and in documenting domestic and global struggles against racial capitalism and imperialism, I had a moment of panic, and I said, what does that mean? I wonder, is that work, what's my work's been about? What is racial capitalism? Then I figured out that I just talk about some of what I have done. Storytelling is what I try to do with the people whom I interview, etc. But I also recognized that racial capitalism is the pond I swim in, that its meaning has been a common parlance for me for more than 40 years, given my association with Cedric Robinson. Sometimes I think that our proximity to a thing makes it loom larger than it is. For example, I remembered my first school as quite grand, but found it quite small decades later when I saw it. Because I've been immersed in media so long, I allow for the possibility that it is not as important as I imagine it. But on a daily basis, I come across constructions that are presented to us as information that dis or misinforms, and that leaves us in the thrall of endless numbers of things that don't serve our own interests. Indeed, they make most of us politically ignorant or disengaged. Likewise, there are the omissions or the erasures, to go to Cedric here for a moment, the erasures from our public discourse that never allow us the possibility of remembering because they are so thoroughly obscured. Only 3 days ago, one of my colleagues from Third World News Review, Gérard Pigeon, told us that the French and British had imported between 150 and 200,000 Chinese people as laborers during World War I, that 20,000 of them had died during the conflict, though they were ostensibly non-combatants, that their pittance of a wage, some of which was meant to go back to their own families, somehow got lost along the way. Who among us would have known to ask about a Chinese presence during the mostly European conflict, erasure, disempowerment, impoverishments of human history? I'd like to show you a short clip from Tunis, taken almost exactly 9 years ago, when I'd visited some journalists there, Tunisian journalists, who were on hunger strike, and I spoke with their lawyer, Radia Nasrawi. I'll tell you more about it after I play it. This is one of the hunger strikers, and the sound, it was a very noisy room we were jammed into with all of them, so I really you won't see any of this, but I'll show you a clip of Radia.
Thought that to start growth, he had to deposit us from all our rights.
My name is Radia Nasrawi. I am a human rights defender, lawyer, and I am president of the Tunisian Association Against Torture. And I am a member of the OMCT, the International Organization Against Torture.
So is that a problem in Tunisia? We don't hear about that, torture.
You don't hear about torture. I think since Ben Ali is here, many people, many Tunisian citizens or Tunisian activists died because of torture in the Ministry of Interior and in police stations, in prisons. I have in my office many files of Tunisians who were victims of torture and who died, but we never can obtain that an inquiry is done to have to know whom has killed or tortured people. The policemen can be quiet. They are protected by the regime. They are protected by the justice. When you go to the court and you say my client has been tortured, they only put your file, your complaint in their office and they forget it. And I think the impunity is the reason why policemen are continuing torturing people in the police station, prisons, and everywhere, even in the street. Last week, they have beaten the president of the Tunisian League of Human Rights, a man who is more than 50, and a man who is respected, who is well known. If they can beat the president of the league, I think we can imagine what they can do to the other people.
I'm just going to stop it there and say that Nasrawi, if you Google her and you find her, you'll find images of her with her face badly beaten and so on. So she put her body where her words are many times. I was in Tunis to attend the World Summit on the Information Society, an international telecommunications union series of meetings where governments and corporations were mapping out their plans for this new information society. This was 2005, I think. 2005. My colleagues and I were there to represent community media, to try to at least raise a peep from civil society, to argue that communication, not information, should be the cornerstone. When we arrived in Tunis, we were followed around by guys in cheap black suits and sunglasses who somehow knew we were coming. We were blocked from our meeting places, searched each time we entered our hotel, found our internet connections blocked, and in the case of a European colleague and a Tunisian one, beaten and arrested. A small group of Tunisian journalists had been hunger striking for more than a month for their own freedom to write, but also for many young people who had been imprisoned for using the internet. The photos you might have noticed above Nasrawi were of some of those young people. The first day of the meetings, we stood in line with several hundred journalists who had perhaps no knowledge or apparent interest in the repressive nature of the Ben Ali regime. The overthrow of Ben Ali would occur a few short years later, and they were probably surprised by it. However, our small international cohort decided to boycott the meetings, to call a press conference in an attempt to expose what was happening to our Tunisian colleagues. We had some success as we were joined by a Nobel Peace Laureate, the mayor of Rome, a human rights rapporteur, and others. But mostly the story was ignored by even many community media outlets. However, we provided a momentary disruption that helped to embolden the Tunisian journalists and a group of trade unionists to come out onto the street for their first openly public demonstration against the Ben Ali government in the participants' memory. let's be very clear here. I'm not taking any credit for the Arab Spring. My point, rather, is that there are always people who are struggling to be heard, who have stories to tell, important ones if they are given an opportunity and a venue. Radia and her colleagues are not unique. Let me say a word now about radio, that rather than a dying medium, it remains the people's medium. It is cheap, ubiquitous, requires no literacy, etc. If you can imagine this, if you imagine, excuse me, that this is the conceit of a radio practitioner, consider this. Last night on MSNBC, there was a long interview with activist Eva Longoria about the coalition of Immokalee workers. They are a group residing in Florida, farm workers. She was appearing to talk about a documentary film about the Immokalee workers and their successful efforts to force an increase in tomato prices on Taco Bell and later Walmart and some other corporations. Hats off to Longoria, but a principal mechanism of the CIW's organizing was a low-power radio station, Radio Conciencia, which they put on the air in 2003. A mere 11 years later, their successful struggle, has been discovered by the liberal corporate media. Through my years in radio, I've had opportunities to interview amazing people. I've interviewed more than half of the people presenting at this conference and co-hosted with a couple of them, Jordan and Avery Gordon, who are both here. And while that has been richly rewarding, it is not my favorite part. Let me recount some of my most fulfilling moments engaging with people whose names you would not know. A woman from Zimbabwe, for example, shouting at a group of Western journalists, "What do you mean an information superhighway? We barely have dirt roads." A mother recounting her meeting with her son at Pelican Bay for the first time in 17 years. When I asked what they did when they finally saw one another after all that time, she said, "We started laughing." A young man from Sierra Leone asking me as I conducted a workshop on interviewing, "What do you do when you're interviewing a former child soldier and someone calls and asks, 'Who is he?' because she thinks he's killed her son and she wants to come to the station and kill him." A fisherwoman, one of those audacious Texas women who tried to sink her shrimp boat to protest the environmental degradation of the Gulf of Mexico due to the willful neglect under the Bush government. A Palestinian man who lost his job as a nurse because he refused to abandon the children in his besieged camp. He has remained there in Nahr al-Bared, serving youth until now. And I should note that Nahr al-Bared is in Lebanon, not in the occupied territories or some other place. The depredations of that extend in so many ways. An Israeli girl, a refusenik, prepared to go to prison rather than serve the aggressive force that calls itself the Israeli Defense Forces. And of course, Radia Nasrawi, who, by the way, could be seen standing in a room celebrating with her country people after Ben Ali fled. There are many more people, and there are issues as well. Avery Gordon and I have committed to covering Palestine regularly until some semblance of justice is obtained, and we have continued to do so. Likewise, we regularly focus on the horrendous prison system in this country and beyond. And again, hats off to Craig and Ruthie in this regard. We and our other co-hosts continue to shine a light on police violence, the depredations visited on immigrant communities, the destruction and destructiveness of our education systems, and as often as possible, we celebrate our people, cultures, and small victories. At the end of the day, I haven't made a dent in racial capitalism, but I hope that I have helped people find their voices and given them the means to be heard, at least for a brief moment. I should note that in the audience today, there may be a handful of students whom I've hoped to imbue with the same values. One of Amark's slogans through the years has been, todos los voces, all the voices. An impossibility, of course, but at the very least, those of us who control the mics must remember to share them, and thereby at least provide an alternative media vision, which in turn might provide a window on a better world. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Tulani Davis.
Thank you. I'm going to read a page and a half, and oh, that's, yeah, peculiar. Can that go away?
Okay, I think she just gets.
Thanks. Oh, sorry.
Closer.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's it. Great. I don't need that, but I need that. Yeah, yeah.
You can see that, and they see that.
Oh, but I need to see the numbers. There's 37 slides. I'm just trying to show you like 11. So I need, yeah, that. Dear.
So we'll just,
But when I did this before, this wasn't there.
how's that?
Okay. I'm going to read a page and a half, and then I'm going to show you those maps, images. My study, Fugitive Freedoms, a Race, Politics, and Black Culture Circuit Before Civil Rights, describes a half-century of Black activism along a circuit carrying the common wind of Black political thought. This circuit, which I call the Emancipation Circuit, includes about 38 sites, which I will show you, and in its earliest incarnation ran from Norfolk, Virginia, along the eastern seaboard from Memphis down the Mississippi to the Mississippi Delta to New Orleans and across the Gulf Coast. I think I can show you. This is what the early version of it would look like. I didn't connect all the sites. Oh, wow, okay. If need be, I can just click through.
Yeah, if there's any tech in the house, what we're seeing here is different than what we're seeing there.
Okay. Just click on slideshow and I'll just click through. Okay. I'm going to keep talking. It was a circuit of railroads, waterways, and Black political work. One of my research questions concerns disparities between the earliest Black political agendas and the aims that emerge in the early 20th century civil rights agenda. Okay, that's not it.
If you just scroll with the
Okay.
go up and down.
Yeah,
like
yeah,
that.
yeah, okay.
Oh dear.
No. Thank you. Okay, I'll just do it that way.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay. I was really nervous about this before we started, and I was like, I got to switch from paper to slides. I usually do one or the other, and then it all worked fine. Okay, so one of the questions I was asking is, if freed people who were mostly agricultural workers considered wages, labor conditions, and violence against them abiding concerns that drove them continually towards attaining autonomy, how did what we know as civil rights end up taking precedence? And also, how did freed people attempt to enact laws to expand the state to address their issues? So I am trying to show how geographically and through time, people built a kind of communications circuit and network really based on communications networks that existed in the slavery era and facilitated by the embargo that Lincoln did of the coast, which is what that image is that you're seeing. This is a cartoon version of what they wanted to accomplish, but Black people fled to those coasts. They fled to the Atlantic coast, to some degree to the Gulf, but also down the Mississippi to anywhere Union troops were. They built settlements, and this is the origin of community building among freed people that I'm writing about. It is also connected through time and geography to the tent shows of blues singers and the Garvey chapters that are built in the 20s. I just haven't done a map yet of the 20s version of how that circuit would look, but it's way more elaborate as you go through time. So I am saying that the emancipation circuit that emerged after the Civil War was a route for the circulation of ideas about citizenship, workers' demands and violence, or cotton prices, political meetings, and tent shows, as well as evolving Black views on labor, gender, blues music, and the prospects for something better down the line. The archive I encountered suggested broadening my thinking on the legacy of freed people and raised questions about setting migration as a barrier between Northern and Southern history. I've skipped a part where I go into a lot of the histories of freed people end with, and then they went north. Most Black people stayed in the South. So what exactly happened after that and up until 1900? They built lots of movements, and I go through counties where I'll show the development of different movements in the same county up to 1900. So you'll see that there's labor movements. Labor movements are incredibly important to people having gained Black political representation. And then you'll find exoduster movements in the same county, or Liberian immigration movements, or one particular county may be really struggling to get Black teachers in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, 90s, or struggling about the vote. All of these things may have happened in all these places, but the documentation I have found thus far suggests that there is a kind of generational impact from those efforts of freed people. I think Paul's work also shows us the later ramifications of exactly that in Florida. The failed constitutional amendments and legislative bills put forward by freedmen reveal concerns with wages, barring violence in workplaces, reparations, gaining and then protecting the vote, support for children of women forced into concubinage during and after slavery, rights of women in property, and other issues that show an expansive, gender-conscious grasp of problems faced in Black communities. In the news were accounts of the 1887 Thibodeau massacre of sugar workers, Black folks in mixed race and mixed gender labor assemblies, fraternal lodges, and other secret societies of the same period had a similar pattern of admitting women or founding women's auxiliaries more quickly and more often than their white counterparts. The archives raise theoretical questions. Did freed people have a more encompassing sense of the political than institutional politics, broader than anything we later called civil rights? and then looking at the legal and commonly violent local barriers to redress. How did they theorize the making of politics? Not incidental to their efforts were attempts to plan for and respond to violence that commonly targeted organizers, new black settlements, political meetings, and labor struggles. What was the discourse that led to the prevalent practice of self-defense and organizing to prevent lynching of individuals taken to jail, for instance? So those are the kind of questions I'm working with. And I'm going to show you some pictures. I made some maps of what I was studying. And I'm going to whisk through to a couple. These are maps based on, oh, you're not seeing them. Okay. Mm-mm. Can you pick it up where it is? Are you just opening that? Because that's what I opened. Wow. I'm going to be able to move to the next one. I hope so. This is a map Abraham Lincoln used during the Civil War showing the slave population. In 1860, red dot, black people who relate to anything in 1868, and that was to the Constitutional Convention. When I first mapped these people, I said, wow, these guys are in danger. They're in a strange relationship. Oh, what happened?
Microsoft PowerPoint's broken.
Okay, but where's my next? Okay, thank you. This made more sense. I put the railroads in. Black people in the middle of Georgia built, this is the circuit they built. It goes along this, this rail line. Down at the left-hand bottom corner, you will see that's Albany, Georgia, and Dougherty County, where there was a massacre. It remained a very dangerous place. Can you show the next one? So then I mapped what two black organizers did, and they couldn't use the trains. They went by horseback on 225 miles roughly each. Two AME ministers, Henry McNeil Turner and a Reverend Costin.
No, we can't even see it.
Wow, this is a far-out experience. Okay, so the two of them basically did a triangle, two different triangles, one inverted, and they covered every black organizer from the AME. Henry McNeil Turner was in charge of it, but they each covered, next one, 16 counties. Anybody who went south to organize black people and teach them how to vote got on horseback and did 16 counties over their period of time there. These are just two trips in the summer of whatever year it says there. 66. Yeah, a couple of weeks each. Two guys, and this is the circuit that elected. They went and found those red dots, who are human beings who went to the Constitutional Convention. Henry McNeil Turner, by the time he got to that southwestern triangle, was like, I think we need to put courage as one of the chief elements, job descriptions for that. Okay, we're just gonna try to move and show you a couple more things. I don't know. Okay, 25. This makes me look way more helpless than I actually am. I don't like it.
It's not your fault. PowerPoint.
Okay, we can stop there. That's good. That's good.
Is it showing? It's not showing.
Is it showing 23?
It's the PowerPoint. There we go.
Okay, this is South Carolina. I'm going to show you Georgia, but I made these maps to show you the building of black political structures and their destruction. In South Carolina, they had black representation in all but 2 counties in 1868. You can see where the yellow is. That's where there was violence, and they succeeded in losing. I have to move to the next one, losing representation. Over time, those yellow, patches get bigger and bigger. In South Carolina, they get reduced to 2 counties by the end of the century. This is an unusual pattern. I'm gonna, can you move to the next one? In Georgia, you can see what typically happens. There's the circuit I was showing you before. On the right-hand side, you'll see evidence, and if you can see the little marks on there, I have marked every place that any of the organizers were victims of violence and or where they had martial law declared, or what you should be getting a picture of, even if you can't read the fine print, is that every area they built structure in was contested pretty much. And there go the actions of the legislatures in throwing people out of the Georgia legislature is in concert with the KKK showing up in the exact same counties. And can we go to the next one? And this is how it progresses through the century. I've tried to also notate, thank you, what tactics were used. They divided counties where there was a black majority in half. They made new counties. They used gerrymandering, voter ID, poll taxes, and tests to eliminate representation. In every case, in all these states, the last map is all yellow. I just want to show, and I'm going to skip because I've got 2 minutes left. Can we go down to 30 and 31? I was going to show Florida because Paul's here, but I just want to show Alabama because this will be familiar, I think, to everyone here. The political structure in Alabama ran from the border of Georgia across to Meridian and Jackson, Mississippi. So it's Tuskegee, Montgomery, Selma. Selma and Meridian, or Meridian, Mississippi, Selma, Alabama, were highly organized. Black people and white people were highly organized 150 years ago. They had in Selma, nobody black went into the jail without 200 people showing up to make sure they didn't get lynched. So part of my project is to show that political structures that were based on multi-generational societies and church activities allowed a progressive pattern to stay in place and for subsequent movements to take place in this same geography over time, so that you end up having situations where, like, exodusters and people who want to immigrate to Africa have to contribute money and save it over years. So they have to keep the local organization alive because it will take 6 or 7 years to build the money for not just one family to move, but for the whole community to move. So it's a different kind of organizing, but it also gave us the beloved community. Thank you.
Our last speaker is Paul Ortiz. Join me in welcoming.
Good afternoon. How's everyone doing? Very good, very good. Thank you. It's very humbling. It's a great honor to be invited to be with such amazing comrades and friends. I want to begin by saying how deeply indebted I am to Dr. Cedric Robinson. The work Black Marxism was a work that changed my life and that changed so many people's lives. And I just want to thank him from the bottom of my heart. And to think that this work brings us together among the amazing works that people, not just in the panel, but everyone here in this room is doing to challenge, to confront racial capitalism in so many different ways. I'm going to do a bit of an unconventional presentation today. I'm not really going to talk as much about workers who are outside of the academy. I want to talk about my students and the challenges that they have in a state like Florida, a state of 20 million people, which in some ways is the tail wagging the American political dog right now, and the deep struggles that they have in trying to figure out who they are and dealing with the system. We don't have race relations in Florida. We have racism, or I got an email from Karen Fields on the way over here, and I was just reminded of the wonderful work in racecraft that Karen and Barbara Fields did. And it's just, when you're in a place like Florida, you're just reminded of this all the time. I gave out a lot of handouts. I'm the director of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, and I want to talk about field work and the field work that our students are doing and putting them in contact with SNCC veterans, with veterans of the Chicano movement, but also the contemporary struggles for ethnic studies in places like Florida and Arizona. I wonder if this works. Can you all see that? Okay, very good. So part of this also comes out of a recent trip that I made to participate in the American Studies Association. We did a wonderful panel organized from one of my former students, Jonathan Gomez, who's now working at UC Santa Barbara. And we did this panel, James Baldwin, Chicano, it was called Chicanos and Latinos Read James Baldwin, and we were invited by people in East LA, teachers, to come out and do the panel in the community, because it turns out that there's a lot of high school students in East Los Angeles who are reading James Baldwin, and so we were really excited to do that. We ended up doing a panel in Eastside Cafe, which those of you that know a lot about Chicano history know it has a very iconic place in Chicano history. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And also, the book that I'm working on now that Jordan mentioned, it's coming out of Beacon Press, on our separate struggles are really one. I'm not going to talk too much about the book except at the very end. Now, like I said, I gave out a lot of handouts. There are two different case studies that I talk about in the book, and both of them involve African Americans who are critiquing racial capitalism, beginning in the 1850s, although that critique began much earlier, from a black abolitionist perspective, and white allies making that critique, connecting capitalism, although generally you don't use the term capitalism in the 1850s, but connecting the commodification of black labor, U.S. imperialism, labor, abolitionists were critiquing that system as well. So I'll talk a little bit about that when I wrap up. I do have also a lot of slides. I'm going to go through them very quickly. When I returned from Los Angeles and I talked to my students, I'm teaching a Latino diaspora class right now, I show them all these slides of murals from El Sereno and other parts of Los Angeles, and they say, where's our tradition? Where's our mural tradition? And I showed them what really bit was a mural that had a depiction of General Antonio Maceo, who's one of the great freedom fighters against the Spanish in the 1870s through 90s. And they said, we don't even have this in Miami, but we do have Miami Heat murals. And the question that they have is, how do we create or recover a tradition of struggle which has been stolen from us? And it is stolen from us in a basic level. Elizabeth began by talking about the critique of schools. Our schools steal our people's histories from us. I didn't grow up learning about this history. Who will teach it? if not us. Florida is a tough place to do, it's a tough place to grow up as a young person. This is the history of the state. It's an in-your-face kind of racist state. It's no different now in many ways, even after generations of struggle. And the dichotomies that people make between South Florida, Miami, Pensacola, and Jacksonville, there are very real differences between those places. But they're all places that are outposts, if you will, of racialized capitalism, of racism. It doesn't matter what part of the state that you're in. This was a slide, this is a picture, a photograph taken by Stetson Kennedy in 1947. And when I did this presentation in East Los Angeles, connecting James Baldwin with Chicano struggles, I juxtaposed these different quotes. Malcolm X talking about, we're not really welcome here. This system wasn't built for us. So how do we create a new system that will work? The United States, we built the country, but we didn't build it, or it wasn't built for us. That's kind of the basic theme. In Florida today, the police act with impunity. They act with maximum violence. This is a case that happened right on the campus of the University of Florida, where I teach. I'm a graduate student, an African student who was a PhD candidate in anthropology, who also had polio, was shot at point-blank range. And basically was, after he was shot and almost killed, in a hospital, helpless, the police charged him with assault on police. And we had to organize a long series of protests, our students did, and initially a lot of shock, but again, this is Florida, this is where we're at. So the police are allowed to just knock down your door, invade your space, and gun you down. And that's the kind of state we live in, that's the kind of country that we live in today. That cover that I showed earlier, those of you that are familiar with Southern history will recognize that cover, the photograph, the marker about African Americans, Puerto Ricans, and Mexicans, was the cover of the Jim Crow Guide, which was published by Stetson Kennedy. And in the Proctor Oral History program, we had a special relationship with Stetson before he passed away. He did a number of interviews, a number of organizing workshops with our students. And I want to talk about some of those, not with him per se, but with other individuals who have spent a lot of time with our students and have helped them kind of get this kind of alternative people's history that they're not getting in the schools. This is a piece that I wrote about Stetson in trying to figure out his legacies in oral history. And again, I'm just going to go through these really quickly, and if folks want to copy this, I'm happy to give them a copy. But one of the things we do a lot is put our students in direct contact with freedom fighters from different movements. Today I'm going to talk mainly about what we're doing in getting our students out and doing oral history field work. In this particular case, John Dew, Attorney John Dew, was a really important civil rights attorney. Our students spent a lot of time with him, not just interviewing him, but just kind of hanging out with him and dreaming about what could be, using his work in 1963 in Macomb, Mississippi, to talk about what's happening now in terms of voter denial in the state of Florida. Because if you follow the news, voter suppression. Florida is ground zero for voter suppression. This has led to a number of different research projects that our students are doing interviews in. I handed out a copy of, well, a couple of things. One is a compilation of a booklet that our students have put together after 7 years of field work. By the way, please keep all that material. I can't take it back home with me, so you can have it. It's free, courtesy of the Proctor program. But when our students are interviewing freedom fighters, veterans of the civil rights movement from SNCC, from CORE, from SCLC, and other social movements, they're learning so much. They get inspired, they get disturbed, they hear tragedies, they hear triumphs, and it's a kind of a people's history, and they hear a lot of people talking about confronting racial capitalism, which I'll get to in a moment. That project, going to the Mississippi Delta, and we've been going there for 7 years now and interviewing civil rights movement veterans, has led into other projects. One is the Latino Diaspora Project, We're going to be going to, we've had students on the ground doing oral history field work with people in the ethnic studies movement in Tucson, which those of you familiar with that know it's been banned recently. I argued a few years ago in a piece that the banning of ethnic studies in Tucson Unified School District is connected to the anti-immigrant movement, which is really a movement not simply to cheapen Latino labor, to keep us disenfranchised, but also to go further. To keep us disenfranchised, you have to tell us we have no history. We have nothing to look back to. Why would we demand citizenship or power in the society if we have no past, no heritage, no legacy? And so in that piece, I connected the labor repression of immigrant workers with the banning of ethnic studies. And our students are really, I think, bearing that out. When we take our students to the Delta, we stop off, and you have to think about, unfortunately, like Lonnie, I don't have any maps. I should have had a map which takes you from Gainesville up north, you take a left turn, and you drive through a town called Tallahassee, Florida. It's our state capital. It's a really tough town. One of the amazing people that we always stop to talk with is Mrs. Laura Dixie, and you can see our students just hanging out with her. We're having lunch. I mean, they're going to interview her at a certain point, but she's a person who's who's been tremendously impactful on our students. She's one of the last living organizers who was a rank and file organizer with the Tallahassee bus boycott in 1956. She was the founding president, as I point out here, of the AFSCME Hospital Workers Union. She used to have to carry a knife to work to defend herself from abusive white supervisors. So she's a person that our students really take to and are very inspired by. Two of the students that I'll talk about here, this is Naila Summers on your left and Caroline Vickers on your right. And the summer after they did this work, Naila became one of the co-founders of the Dream Defenders, which organized, of course, initially in the wake of the murder of Trayvon Martin. Caroline Vickers, on the other side, went to law school, and her focus now is really on social justice law at Howard. And so interacting and being with these freedom fighters has had a big impact on these students' lives. Brianne Palmer here. Brianne is Georgetown University, Georgetown Law, and the types of law you're encouraged to go into in South Florida, where most of my students are from, you're not encouraged to go into public interest law. You're not encouraged to go into any kind of advocacy for human rights or environment or anything like that. And so when they spend time doing this field work, it really does change their lives. And it's also very inspirational for the movement veterans to know that people are still open-minded, that there's a lot of problems in the society, and that young people are trying to figure out what's going on. So the interactions that are taking place are very important. And when we get to Mississippi, I mean, I can teach people certain things in a classroom. I can prepare them, maybe. I can give them things to read. I can give them lectures. I can play tapes in class. But when we get there and the field teams start doing their work, I step back. I mean, that's the time for me to just kind of fade into the background. And that's the time where their learning begins. A few years ago, we brought Lawrence Guillot, who you know is one of the co-founders of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, and again, simply put him in contact with high school students in the Mississippi Delta and our students. He did a 2-hour organizing workshop with our students. It was just amazing. And it was all about, you know, we kept historical questions about back life in the 60s and the MFDP, but he wanted to talk to us about now. You know, what are you doing now? What are the issues confronting you? What are the social problems you're dealing with in Florida? Sometimes the place is kind of speaks for itself. This is the Emmett Till Museum, what will become the Emmett Till Museum in Glendora, Mississippi. It was profoundly moving. It has always been profoundly moving for our students to talk to members of the Till family who still live in Glendora, a town of just a very few hundred people. And for them to be there and to participate, and then again for the people in Glendora to see these people from Florida coming year after year after year, you know, people begin linking struggles, linking stories. It is all about storytelling. If you don't share your stories with people, you can't build any kind of movement, any kind of struggle. We do a lot of organizing workshops in between the interviews. This is one with Gwendolyn Zohar Simmons. Those of you familiar with the history of SNCC know she was the project director for SNCC at Laurel, a very tough place in Mississippi for a year and a half. She's also a professor at the University of Florida, so it's really a tremendous thing to have her. I'm just going to tool through some really quickly here. This is Genesis Laura. She's working here, did an interview with Alan Cooper, and she's a student who's actually leading the Tucson field trip. Those of you who have this handout here, you'll see the field trip participants. You'll see that almost all of these are first-generation students of color, like Genesis. She's from the DR. And the impact of this trip on her, in part, is her saying, coming back and saying, let's organize a field trip to Tucson. Let's figure out what's happening down there. Let's learn about what young people are doing in terms of struggle. This gets us to the East LA, the James Baldwin piece, which I can talk more about in Q&A. But essentially, it was connecting Baldwin with El Sereno now, and connecting Harlem. What I try to do is kind of ground with people around Harlem in the 1930s as a historian, what they're doing now, what they face in El Sereno, which obviously there's a lot of similarities in terms of over-policing, gang violence, the gentrification. You see the historical iconography here. Ruben Salazar, one of our great investigative journalists, gunned down by the LA Sheriff's Department. Again, it's a story that our students, I'm trying to teach our students in Florida as well. That's the interior of East Side Cafe. You actually see Donna Murch in the end, who drove us around one night with Matt Cedillo, and it was real fun. She's been doing a lot of work in Ferguson. And these are just interior shots. But again, I guess I want to conclude on this point that basically we read Baldwin today to help us grapple with these questions. How do we survive with dignity in a society that clearly was not made for us? Baldwin's critique of innocence, of American exceptionalism, the fight against U.S. imperialism, and economic justice struggles. And the last slide I'll kind of end on is, well, two real quick, is in the book African American and Latino Histories, what I'm doing is I'm talking about something Du Bois said that he referenced as the government of American banks. When Du Bois talked about imperialism, he tried to be as specific as possible. And so when he talked to the National Convention of the NAACP in 1928, he said, what we're grappling with here is the government of American banks and what it does to people in Nicaragua and Cuba and Haiti and the Philippines and the United States. And this is why we have to fight to get the ballot back. It's about fighting corruption. That's the world that my students and our students grow up in now, a very corrupt political world. No one wants to admit it's corrupt, but it is, and they know it, and they tell us. And so that's why I think Du Bois and Baldwin are so critical. And this is, if we were doing a classroom lecture, I would just give you notice I'm a teacher, some learning outcomes from our separate struggles are really one, but that's really kind of the gist of what I had to say. Again, please keep all these handouts. I actually have some tapes, some DVDs of some of the organizing workshops with Lawrence Guillot and some other folks. I have them up here. And please, I want to give them all out. I don't want to take them back with me to Florida. They might try to stop me at the state line. So please take them. And thank you so much for your patience.
If I could ask the panelists to come back up, and thank you. I think, each of these presentations kind of helps us, reframe the role of ideology and of culture in anti-racist social movements. And in different ways, they help us grasp, I think, the stakes in the struggle in language, in the arts, and in media, over the meaning of events. So I wanted to just present a couple questions, then I'll open it up so we'll have about a half hour to engage as a whole. But in an interview Talani did a few years ago, she explained that being an artist is about listening. And I think we could probably extend that to say, being an oral historian, being a journalist is about listening. And I wonder if you could, each of you could maybe talk about that in your respective work, particularly the critical importance, as Elizabeth was saying, to the voices and the visions of social movements, confronting torture, confronting state violence, confronting the kind of destruction of the networks that are created out of struggles themselves. So, yeah.
Can I defer to Lani since it was her
Of course, sure.
Okay. As a journalist, I think for me, listening was critical. But I find in trying to do history that it's really critical for me to set meta-narratives aside and just look at the archive. I have what I call the 7 stations of the cross of Black history in my head from long ago, from decades. And what's in the archive suggests other things if you're not just looking for the 7 stations. So to me, it's a different kind of listening, or it's like looking with an open mind, and that was necessary. I came to this project because I was here at CUNY in 07, 08, doing a project on Ma Rainey, Bessie Smith, Alberta Hunter, and their connections. They have musical connections, but I really started to notice where they were performing, and it turned out to be all the places that were in my reading for my comprehensive exams on what happened after the Civil War. I was like, okay, this, like the Blues Trail in Mississippi that you can follow as a tourist now, is a much older communications network that also built the blues circuit. It built the Garvey chapters. It includes the places where the civil rights movement happened, but it was really built by building railroads after the Civil War. So for me, that's the kind of listening I do now. It's just like see what it's saying and then try to figure out what that means later. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, in oral history, I was rereading a presentation that Karen Fields did at the Oral History Association many years ago. And for our students in Florida who are from Miami, who are part of a post-1959, if they're from the Cuban diaspora, they're trying to recover family histories, not just simply the history of the 10 Years' War, the histories of 1898, the struggle against racism in Cuba in the early 20th century. They're just simply trying to recover their own family genealogies that have been cut off from them for many different reasons. You know, Genesis Laura, I think about her because, I mean, she's not Cuban American. She's from the Dominican Republic, but the same types of silences, I mean, she grew up with the same types of silences about politics in the DR, the kind of the haunting experience of this amazing revolutionary movement in the early 1960s that collapses in large part because of the US military invasion. So what do you do with that? You know, you almost got there and it was crushed. There's a lot of fear, a lot of shame. And so for her, getting into oral histories and learning these stories of struggle in the African diaspora, I think really helped prepare her to come back her senior year, and she wrote a wonderful senior thesis on the revolutionary movement in the DR, including talking to her own family members who were part of that struggle. And I think that's one of the things I've learned a lot from Karen Fields in terms of, you know, why we do oral history. What Karen said in her presentation, I think it was in the mid-'80s, was that we need to understand the wisdom that's out there. And we need to relate to people. Of course, she was working on a history of her grandmother at the time, which became Lemon Swamp. That book is so important. It's important to return to that work. For me, I guess it's been very, very important. But getting our students, helping them, and just sometimes telling them, yes, validating, yes, go and look at your family history. It's important, it matters. Especially in a place, people don't realize what a closed society a city like Miami can be. If you grow up in it, it's hard for me to explain it to you. These conversations that I have, I was talking to Dan Widener earlier, are some of our students, Cuban-American students who worked in the Barack Obama campaign in '08, I mean, for them it was a revolutionary activity. And I tried to explain to my friends in California and New York who were saying, well, you know, Barack Obama is going to sell out all this. I said, no, you don't understand what it means, the tremendous hope and the fact that these students now are going to go on and become organizers in other struggles, which is what has happened.
I'm debating about this a little bit because I'm going to say something that maybe is not so nice always. But I think as a young woman, I listened because that was what was expected. I wasn't expected to speak so much. And in the early days of my relationship with Cedric, we'd go places, and you know, somebody going to grad school was a big deal to me. I didn't know anybody that had gone to grad school. And we'd be around grad students. He was a grad student. And it was intimidating to me, so I listened perforce. And then at some point, I figured out that if I didn't say something, somebody else was going to say what I was thinking. And then there was a period where I'd say something, and somebody, you know, we'd be in a little informal seminar, and somebody would say later, you know, when Cedric said X, and I'd say, wait a minute, I said X. And so the listening was part of my learning. So that's one piece of it. The other, I think, is that I always enjoyed listening to old people from my family and elsewhere. And so I became, I think, a good listener. And now I've, of course, become an old person, so I'm, but it's those kinds of things which, if you're not listening carefully to people, you're missing so much. So it's just, it's necessary, as both of you say. And sometimes it's not obvious what it is they're trying to say, and if you're not listening carefully, it's really easy to get off at the wrong stop.
I used to be shocked when I came home with the tape and then listened to the tape after I'd interviewed somebody. One, they might be in a totally different mood than I thought I was getting by watching their face. They might be smiling, but the voice is totally hostile. And just listening to the tape later, I'm going, wow, he was in a bad mood. But you also aren't really, you have to listen over and over is what I'm saying.
We'll share this.
Okay. Share mic. I'm not touching any more technology.
Also, if I could,
go ahead.
Just real quick, there's also a distinction with learning versus studying. And this is something we try to teach in oral history. You know, Alessandro Protelli has told us over and over again. When our students go out, when we do field work, we're learning from people. We're not putting them under a microscope. And again, if we're talking about building social movements and linkages between different locations, that's fundamental. And I think that's one of the reasons why there is a gap between, oftentimes, movements on campuses, and maybe why in recent years the college campus, university campus, in many cases has been marginal to broader social movements. I find it to be very, very interesting because we're not really listening to what's happening, you know.
Well, I have a lot more to ask, but more importantly, you probably do. So I'd like to open it up if I can, and we have a mic here. Because we're being live streamed, we'd ask you to come to the mic to ask questions, but I'll walk around with this as well. So who will be brave and step forward first? Danny, let me bring you a mic, though.
I don't want to step forward, but I can be brave. Set of circumstances present themselves. Good morning, everyone. I want to thank all of the panelists for really provocative comments. And the question I have, in listening, I was struck in that everybody spoke to a certain extent or another about multi-generational linkages within the context of particularly Black self-activity in the South. And I'm trying to get a sense of whether or not the antagonism that I perceive in a more contemporary moment within the broadly defined Black community around generational issues is new or not. I guess I don't want to presume that there weren't intergenerational conflicts at other moments. So I guess I want to hear people's thoughts about whether it's accurate to perceive a different level of communication and contact within generations today, and if that poses a problem for the kinds of organizing that people are speaking to, or if that's really an erroneous perception driven by my despair at the absence of an already existing mass social movement.
I'll speak to the freed people. Those ministers I showed traveling around Georgia, on average, they were speaking to 3,000 people at a time. They are speaking to entire communities. One of the beauties of the process of having meetings, what I call a kind of holistic participatory democracy that freed people engaged in or devised for themselves, was that anyone could speak, children and women included. Many military people, like in the coastal towns, tried to tell freed men that freed women need to stay home, not come to the meeting. That didn't really work out. So in meetings in Richmond, you have women testifying to sexual assault by the same military people, Union soldiers who are stationed in Richmond, being thrown in the jail, gang raped, things like that. So you are also having women articulate issues that are otherwise not shared in public arenas in the 1860s, otherwise in this country. You don't have women getting up and saying they were made concubines earlier in life. In a southern place, anybody in the room probably could guess who the person was who had, had this woman enslaved. So I think they started out with a different need to all be in the same room. The needs were so dire, and the needs were so all-encompassing, from food, clothing, shelter, to having to set up a group of sentries to stay outside their tent city, because Union soldiers came in there at night to steal blankets. So I feel like it's similar to what happened with the Southern Civil Rights Movement. Everybody had the same things at stake, so everybody had a voice. Did we change that in some way? Yes, I think we probably did.
I mean, just to echo what Dr. Davis is saying is that, it's important to understand, and you mentioned in your comments, how sophisticated African-American political cultures were in the wake of emancipation. And I rarely have ever seen works, on a few occasions at least, certainly your work, and others in this room certainly, where people really understand what that means. The theft of citizenship from an entire group of people couldn't help but have an impact on the ways in which those people communicate with each other over a period of time. And I think that's something that we haven't come to grips with. We certainly haven't come to grips with that in the broader political culture. What did it mean to steal people's citizenship, not just once, but even if you went back to the 1830s in the North, these newly enfranchised African Americans in the wake of the American Revolution, a relatively small number, but still the targets of disenfranchisement campaigns. And what would that mean for kind of an internal coherence or a sense of heritage? And so there are a lot of broken linkages there. I think it's important not to, on the one hand, over-romanticize the level of community that people had back in those days, but at the same time, it's important not to forget the levels that they did in fact have. I think we need to think about technology too, and how technology can sometimes, we have allowed sometimes technology to attenuate these ties of community. And we do little funny things like say, well, I don't know how to operate this new piece of equipment. A young person knows how to operate it, right? And which is often true, But at the same time, we've forgotten older ways of learning and wisdom that are quite important.
Really quickly, I don't want to get started on social media and things like this because I find it problematic in a lot of ways in terms of disconnects for people, and certainly generationally, that's one of the things that happened, but maybe for me, the least problematic part, because I think it's atomizing in a lot of ways. So I know some of you use it beautifully, but it does concern me in terms of the difference between coming to a place together and crossing distances via the web. So that's, I guess, one of my thoughts. And the other is just in terms of those histories, those family histories. In working with high school students, which I did for a while, I would try to get them to go home and ask their parents. They were mostly Latino kids. And I said, go and ask your mother or your father or your grandparents to tell you their story. It was virtually impossible for them at that age because they were, in some ways, going through teenage alienation from their parents or whatever, I guess, I don't know. But they were also, as first-generation kids, maybe embarrassed a little bit about that history of their families. I don't know what it was all about, but it was really difficult to get them to valorize those older generations at that point. Most of us don't really get there until it's too late to be able to talk to the people we want to talk to.
I just would add, though, I think for a lot of us in the room, multi-generational participation was enforced by patriarchy. So, I mean, you had to go, you had to be there. You didn't know you were being taught skills that you would use in life. I was doing voter registration at 11, not because I woke up one morning and said, I need to know how to register people to vote, even though I am too young to vote. But when I got to Columbia in the 60s, all of the black students there knew how to organize. So what did? We took over a building. And it was easy because we already had organizing skills. And my students now, they don't really have that experience with how to make their voices heard in a group. I do, when I say I think, yes, we changed some things, there's something about that iron rule of patriarchy, and Sunday you put on your patent leather shoes and go to church, you will be going, that was operative, so.
One person here, and then we'll take two.
I'm a choreographer and I work with movement, and I wanted to say this because I thought somebody else would say it, so I thought about you. What comes to mind are a couple different things. Multi-generational dehumanizing and in technology. And I was working with a psychologist, and we were talking about technology and the nonverbal communication that goes on or doesn't go on. And then she talked to me about, well, what's really important that we don't really know is that a part of our human development, the things that make us human, is the nonverbal and being able to read that. And so when we talk about technology and a generation that is so addicted to technology, then we're talking about another generation that's being dehumanized, maybe. I don't know. But I see this because we don't do these physical things to read in between the lines, because the words are, not as descriptive. So I just wanted to speak to that.
Thank you. I just actually want to ask a question that goes back to the theme of the panel, which is radical political imaginaries. Because, Elizabeth, you started making an interesting distinction between communication and information. I know what you mean by that, but, and Tulani, I like the idea that we would replace the 7 stations of the cross with some kind of new circuits. And so I just wondered if people might say a little bit about what you see now as the most necessary or promising elements or possibilities for radical political imagination today.
I agree with you. I mean, I don't know how to move the way I used to when I was younger, certainly. I mean, just because there's so much that we do that's stationary. And just the gesture that you made in terms of talking about moving, it speaks in ways that I think we lose. I mean, I know that people post a lot of things, including old video and things like that of musicians that otherwise we wouldn't see, et cetera. But there's that coming together that I think is just really important. So I agree with you. In relation to Avery's question and my comment, communication versus information, to go back to the WSIS, the World Summit on the Information Society, and all of that, or to go to NPR or PBS. I mean, the point is to distribute information to you, or to distribute culture or whatever. But there is not an understanding of it as a two-way or a multi-way conduit. That's information, maybe a superhighway or a dirt road, I don't know. But communication implies exchanges. And those are the things that I think are critical in terms of being able to organize and imagine a way forward for me. In terms of what those ways forward are, I think for me, one of the first things is to heighten people's criticality of what they're consuming all the time. That's not enough, however, because some of us never learn how to stop criticizing and start doing something. But maybe it's because of people I've encountered just even in the last month. I am struck by the depth of the thought of some of the young people that I've encountered. Younger academicians, younger people who are outside the academy, et cetera. So it seems to me that in some ways we're at a cusp, and I don't know what to do beside encourage that, because I think it's become, more and more repressive, and the repressiveness maybe is what will, necessitate action for people who either haven't been active or don't know exactly how to be active. I don't know if that's an answer to your question.
I mean, how do you take on a corporation? How do you get a corporation to change its behavior? That seems to be a critical building block. If you're talking about confronting racial capitalism, we have to teach each other, well, how do we deal with these fundamental units of capitalism? Elizabeth mentioned earlier this new film, The Coalition of Immokalee Workers. We premiered that film in Gainesville just 2 nights ago. And the wonderful thing about that film is, well, Ava Longoria is great and everything, but she's not really the wonderful thing about the film. The wonderful thing about the film, it shows a fairly recent struggle, that is the Coalition of Immokalee Workers struggle, forcing corporations to change their behaviors. Again, it's not a revolutionary activity, but forcing them to pay a penny per pound more for tomatoes. Imagine that. The reason that's important is that it's had a real impact in the lives of workers in the tomato harvest. It could be the difference between earning $13,000 per year and $16,000 per year. That's an enormous difference for a person that works in migrant labor in South Florida. And the film shows the CIW's trajectory and what they borrowed from the United Farm Workers, what they took from that, the 60s struggles. It talks about racialized capitalism in agriculture. It never uses the term, but Eric Schlosser and others say, well, isn't this interesting that so many of these generations of workers have been people of color? And it's not the whole thing again, and it shows the anti kind of Taco Bell campaign, the McDonald's campaign, the Burger King campaign, and it's showing to an audience of people who begin to think, well, maybe it is possible to win a struggle, because it's happening. I think it's right. And radio has played it as, I just want to magnify again, or just kind of echo what you're saying, Elizabeth, about the importance of radio. People are rediscovering radio in part because of web-based radio, but also low-power stations play a key role in these movements.
I think one thing that's real important is to foster the use of the imagination. I work across a lot of genres, but one side of my brain actually feeds the other. Each interest really assists the other in either building structures or having new ideas. So I really feel like young people of any generation know how to reach their peers, and they know what their barriers are, what the barriers are for them. That's the place to begin. It's like when the incidents in Ferguson started unfolding and unfolding, I was like, where are the usual suspects? The people who are there now teaching nonviolent protests or whatever, the professionals, I even consider myself among them. And I saw some scholars I know who were giving interviews, but I know they were doing research on that community. That's why they were there. But it is really interesting to see how, given that you know what your barriers are and you know how to reach people who are your contemporaries or your neighbors, how do you begin from scratch? That community is not building dissent the way we would have done it or the way old folks know how to do it. They really had to figure out how to engage at a different point in what we might view as a normal process. They had to engage cynicism. They had to ask people, can you imagine a reason to keep going, to do something? What should that thing be to do? They had to deal with people who think voting's not important. So for me, it's like something very, very important that's going on, because it is speaking to us about communities who are not already prepped for organizing, who, and we have so many thousands of communities that are Ferguson, that it's really important for all of us to understand what's happening there, to learn something from it, to amplify it where we are, and also to see, isn't this how it always is? Did Friedman know anything about organizing mass rallies and making sure there were 200 guys with rifles on the peripheries? No, they had to learn it the hard way. So for me, if we look at our roots in people who were the most incredibly mobilized generation we've ever had, even including the 60s, freed people, mobilized people in 11 states for a sustained period of time, 10 years. They could get a crowd out for whatever it was. They got a crowd out for Souls to the Polls, where people were going to get shot for exercising the vote. So for me, we have not had generations of people who were prepared and taught organizing, but people who learned to improvise. So for me, it's like to strengthen young people to have faith in their imagination, the connections they make between things that we might not get off on first hearing, and also then to share whatever wisdom the elders have, but after the elders have been listening. Because I really do think we are relearning communicating. When we stop listening and get ready to talk, we have to be relearning that. So there's a young man sitting here who saw a couple of my maps and said, could you make the captions bigger? And I was like, yes, I could do that. Because I could make the maps an experience by themselves. So I think I didn't know exactly what it meant to him, but it didn't matter, because I'm trying to learn to communicate. So yeah, I think fostering the thing we don't understand, human imagination, helps.
Hi. I'm really struggling with what it means to be a black, what is a black radical tradition today, primarily in terms of how most folks, just within the black community even, let alone outside of it, would see or would think of the notion of a black radical tradition. I think we've gotten to the point where wearing a button and attending a march could easily be perceived as being a black radical, and that button might simply say, hands up, and the march might simply be, simply, quote unquote, be against police abuse and for a civilian review board. And that notion is radical in many people, simply because one is standing up and organizing and protesting and calling for the end to something which is just so extreme. But as we know, that's not fundamentally radical. And I mean, yes and no. It is in the sense that in a place like Ferguson, it's the first time folks are organizing and just the process itself in a long time. But I'm very curious with the very unique historians who are here today to hear what you're finding, if you're doing contemporary research, among the folk, not just among the institutional sort of elite that we talk about, but the unique historical work that you do in churches, in civic groups, in youth groups. Are black folks talking about something that is deeper than just the right to stay alive and not be imprisoned? Is there a connection, not just superficially, but a connection, a critique and a plan of action linking to the deeper issues? Because it seems like there is just such an absence of that deeper critique and the linkages of those issues. So I just wonder what folks are finding.
Let me take one more question and then.
Okay. Thank you all for your work. As you guys were speaking, and Paul, you kind of answered this already, I started to think about the connection of oral histories and emancipation at the present. So I come from this town called Oxnard, California. It's 60 miles north of LA. And so, they've been deporting 20 to 30,000, Latino Mexicans, whatever you call it yourselves, for the last 2 years. And so we've been getting stories from people in my community, and it's, I really connect it to modern day convict leasing, right? Because they're being shipped to Tacoma. There's 30,000 people that are working in these. And so my question is how do we create, and this is just a radical Chicano imagination, right? Where we have this instant oral histories that are able to be created to bring attention to this massive oppression that's been taking place.
Well, I think these two questions are linked together. The critique is there, and when you think about a group like the Dream Defenders in Florida, which self-consciously identifies itself as a black and brown organization of people in struggle, and they have been in close contact with people involved in the Dream activist movements in the West Coast, and there are these deeper critiques of injustice, people connecting the disenfranchisement of 12 million so-called undocumented people today with Jim Crow, kind of classical Jim Crow. So these deeper radical critiques are everywhere. In fact, I almost say they're pervasive. Can people act on them, though? That's the question. In Tallahassee, many of you remember just a couple summers ago, the Dream Defenders, this is the first time that our governor was actually driven out of the Capitol. Once those students sat in the state Capitol in Tallahassee, all of a sudden our Tea Party governor became a world traveler. He was terrified. He not only left Tallahassee, he left the state of Florida because you had this group of students who sat in and they just wouldn't leave. They did have some elders come and say, you've done a really good job, you're here for a day, you made your point, now let us take over. They were very respectful. They said, thank you for your input, wise elder from the 1960s, but we're going to stay, And so I think that these critiques are everywhere. The thing we have to understand, though, is how, I want to return to this question of corruption. We live in a pervasively corrupt political and economic society where corruption is, kind of borrow an old Graham Parker song, it's from the bottom to the top. And we have to understand that the young people coming up now, kids, I can remember, I guess, my first awareness of this was in 4th grade. I thought, wow, what? But I grew up in a military town, I grew up in a shipyard town, so the advantage that we had was knowing right away that we were the ones who were kind of the soldiers of empire, that we would always be sent out. 3 generations of Ortiz men, we all ended up in the military, we all ended up in these weird kind of foreign imperial projects. It doesn't always, though, lead to political action if you have a radical, even if you have an understanding about what's happening and how corrupt your society is, it can lead to cynicism. It can lead to despair. And how do we work away from that is a question.
I think you're right to stay alive, to walk down a street in the city without being shot by a policeman doesn't require a lot of analysis, and it is a radical thought in a sense that you should be able to walk down the street. I do think it is part of what has always mobilized people, something that's very easy to understand. Do you have a right to survive in this culture? And so maybe what we're saying is someone providing or introducing us to an additional analysis about how to contend with that? And there, I think Black radical tradition is a conundrum. Is it a set of conventions from the past, or does it have life? I think that's what you're asking, right? Does it have applicability right now and a pulse? And I think yes and no. I think part of our problem is the atomization you're talking about. In some senses, in the digital age, when it's very easy to communicate with 100,000 people at once, it's really hard to have a conversation among 2 people. And that one thing I've been hearing today is being in the same room with somebody. I do think whenever people say, we need to have a conversation in the culture about that, it's an announcement that it's never going to happen. So it's like, we do need to be in rooms where there's dialogue, and a lot of them are gone. So a lot of the venues for work where Black people worked and possibly might have joined a union, those are gone. Those factories in Fort Greene, they're gone. So there are people who are in a room together in that neighborhood when they go to vote. But what happens before then? Are they in a room together having this discussion? What's their analysis of the condition right now? So I think a lot of the institutions that we had are very challenged right now. And I would say really we need to think about, I'm a theater person, and I know incredible things happen to people's minds if they're in a dark room watching something together. Total enemies can be in the same room, and if they have the impression that all sides will be spoken for on that stage while the lights are out, they're fine with that. We know how to do that in this culture. We know how to have that conversation. So I think more rooms, more situations for us humans to feel what people are saying when they talk about the suffering they would like to work against.
So Elizabeth, and then we have time for one more question from Ravin.
I will try to be short because I'm not going to answer what the Black radical tradition is. Hang around for a couple days. I'm sure there will be some answers for that. The only thing that I would say is, following on what Paul was saying, I'm sure that the Black radical tradition is a much broader frame than it was 30 years ago. Black and brown and various other ethnic groups, whether we call them people of color or whatever, there is a different frame, and I think that immediately allows for some different possibilities. The oral history, I think, is really important, and getting to it is not always easy because of the kinds of barriers that Daniel was asking about earlier. But I'm also want to say that we have to really be clear that we're not going to look inside the academy for all of this. And For example, I've been working a little bit with a Mistec group in Oxnard who have gotten a low-power radio license for themselves, who have been alienated from the Latino community or the Chicano community, the Mexicano-Chicano community, who are contemptuous of them as Oaxaquitos, little people, little brown people. But they know why they want a radio station, and they know why having radio in their language rather than in a colonial language, be it English or Spanish, is important. So those little pockets of, I don't know, recognition, whatever, I think are really important. And that's something to look for.
I'll try to be brief. So much. This is a wonderful panel. What I want to do is I want to actually invoke Cedric and then connect his ideas to all three talks and to the question about what a black radical, in fact, to even Avery's question about networks. One of the things that Cedric taught me, at least, in Black Marxism, is that C.L.R. James, W.B. Du Bois, Richard Wright, and all these others had to discover this thing called the Black radical tradition because it's not self-evident. In fact, it took deep, deep archaeological work to even make it visible. And so here we are living in a moment where we sometimes treat it as if it's self-evident, like where is it? And what's great about all three talks and all your work, I mean, Elizabeth, you basically are discovering those voices. I mean, the voices that are so important are the ones we don't know, and make them visible. Thulani, your work is extraordinary because you've completely revised the way we think about political organizing in the Reconstruction era, where it's not about just local, nor is it about people testing the waters of freedom by just roaming around, but instead establishing institutions that go even beyond the Black towns. And so what you discovered were the existence of organized structures and mass movements that, Du Bois hinted at. He knew they existed. Stephen Hahn knew they existed. But you're finding them and their linkages to each other. And in Paul's work, so amazing, the kind of research he did on Florida and the levels of violence and levels of opposition to that, we didn't know that. So my whole point is that we don't know. And if you talk about Ferguson, it's interesting because Ferguson is part of St. Louis, which is part of a really well-organized, amazing place where people like Jamala Rogers and Organizational Black Struggle have been there for 40 years. And so we sometimes think, oh, well, this is new. And it appears new because it appears that way. Even among Lost Voices, among even the young people, many of them have organized, but in other ways that are not so visible. The Crips and the Bloods, they're organized, and they're out there as part of Lost Voices. Hands Up United. These are people who are young, but have sort of traditions and histories and relationships. Because to go back to Cedric again, their opposition sometimes is not legible to us because they don't operate in the logic structured by capital. And so if that's the case, then we actually have a lot of work to do to try to determine what, not where do we go from here, but just what is actually existing already that's there in formation that many of us are alienated from, that don't appear to be structured by the logic of capital, and yet offer sometimes the sharpest critique of it. And so I just want to thank all of you for that work because you keep reminding us why scholarship, research, analysis, being on the ground, organizing, all this stuff matters because nothing is self-evident. I guess that's just my own.
I think that's a beautiful place to end the panel, and to remind you that we have another event today at 6:30 that's going to occur at the Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute, which is at 20 Cooper Square. And we'll be there. Note, if you'd seen the website before, you may have thought that it was 6 o'clock, but instead we'll start at 6:30 and we'll go until 8:30 p.m. We also have posters here with that information, And we look forward to seeing you there as well as tomorrow. Thanks again, and maybe join me in thanking our panel once more.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. Thank you, and I'm sorry about your slides to begin with. That was just like, I'm sure, totally unnerving. But it all comes through. It all comes through.
You did.
I think a lovely.
Very sick about it.
Jordan.
And I have tapes too.
I think it. I think it. You weren't obviously nervous.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's good.
I don't know if I was obviously nervous either.
No, it's great. I mean, I think it's going to be getting really well.
Someone gave me money.
Hi, Esther.
You don't want a donation?
Well, I didn't tell you.
Yeah, we sort of knew you might come, but yeah. Thank you. What's your name? Sorry. Kehan, nice to meet you. I'm glad. I hope it was useful. Good. Good.
Doing well. We're looking forward to, talking really soon about police
Lawrence Guillot is amazing. I mean, he was such an incredible
find out what all
You knew
these goodies
Guillot.
were.
Yes. I was amazed that he died.
Yeah, so it's so cool to get to know you guys. I'm excited. I feel like it's a continuation of like racing class.
Helping educators figure out how to use.
Fantastic, yeah.
Bring it into their class. Figure out how to get their students thinking about how to react to the system.
Hey, baby.
Wow. Yeah, the detention camp that they had for Haitian refugees.
Let's see what Paul is handing out over here. He kept referring to him. You did? Okay. The little guys are the little girls who did something. Okay.
I'll see you tonight. Okay. Yeah.
In fact, we opened our last circuit conferences with performance pieces. If you want to do a workshop or a session,
Now I'm done. Remind me, stuff I'm responsible for. I can kick back and relax with. Jordan, after you. After. Yeah, he's from Mississippi. Yeah. Hi.
I worked in racing class for them too.
Arun.
We worked together, yes.
Nice to see you.
And you.
So what it took was people break it. What we see in court is a lot of students have undocumented parents. Then the students have to be taken on almost a whole role. They're not really comfortable with it. Not every communication is anything but working at the restaurant or feel that they can't go shopping, they can't walk in, they can't. So children often end up having to take those roles.
I teach English.
You see that, yeah.
And I also actually work with Mayor's Office in Adultification. We made a TV show for immigrant adults on their English and also how to access these services. New York City is very progressive.
Yeah, please take those. So those are the types of battles we're fighting. And so when the question is, like, to echo what Todd was saying, in that case, radicalism could be getting parents and parents access to because now they don't have that unless there's teachers or principals, because we don't have anyone to court who would be like mayor.
I'll be right back.
I'll be right back. Yeah, and again, look us up at the World History Association, and we would love. Okay, great. Well, let's see. We had our annual conference was actually in Little Rock back in. Of course, this was a while ago. This was like 2006. Okay. Yeah, I know there's been a lot of good oral history work there, but yeah. Well, yeah, please, let us know if there's anything we can do to be of assistance with what you're doing. That's great. And you have it in the summers? It's in the summers. Okay. Yeah, I think I have a lot of students and former students who would be very interested in doing it. Yeah. Well, cool. Do you have a card? Do you have this? Yeah. And that, when I act, I'll let people know. Oh, very cool. All right. Awesome. Yeah, I did oral history. When were you at Evergreen?
I was there 2006.
Thank you. 2006 to 2010.
Okay, very cool. Sam Schraker.
Okay.
Was there, who did a lot of folklore and oral history projects.
Wonderful.
So I was like, I've always wanted to meet you because I've heard about you through other people's work.
Thank you.
And being a
Yeah.
next. Yeah, I'm up here.
It's a wonderful project. And again, it's kind of like what Rob and Kelly was saying towards the end. It's not necessarily things that we go from here. We're turning out. Very restrictive. It is. It's a huge questions. You know, this summer, my wife and I went to Belfast and other places. And just the reason we went there, one of the slides I showed that I brought back to the was this whole long row of political murals in Belfast and the connections that people in Belfast have made for generations to freedom struggles all throughout the world. And one of the things that defines working class Catholic neighborhoods and Protestant neighborhoods there is this rooted in military. So you see a mural, and it's a mural of, say, someone like Augustine, and then, you know, a block away. This is a link to all of our material. All right, so I said, hey, we have a bunch of drive. Yes, I'm an one who did not know. We're talking about Bobby Sands. This wonderful project on kind of radical imaginations of liberation beyond just the nation state thing, you know? And I was telling about how this summer I was in Belfast. You know, whether you're talking about Douglas or Sands or a lot of, you know, anti-apartheid struggles. And the newest ones that were coming up when we were there were the Gaza Solidarity. Yes. And we were walking around this you have to imagine, it's not for the union class, that would all working class, most Americans are poverty. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, like 100 people come marching out of this neighborhood with Palestinian flags. And the marching began down Belfast, protest in front of the DNC building because of biased coverage.